She was 8 weeks pregnant, standing in a room full of men who would kill for her husband, and she had never felt more alone in her life. The chandeliers above the Moretti Grand Ballroom threw light across 500 faces. Senators, CEOs, and crime bosses wearing tailored suits and borrowed smiles. And none of them looked at Vivian. Not once. She was the wife, the decoration. The woman standing slightly to the left of the most dangerous man in the room, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched. She was wearing a gown that cost more than most people made in a year, carrying a secret that was slowly eating her alive. She had come tonight to tell him. That was the only reason she had put on the dress, done her hair, and walked back into the world she had been quietly disappearing from for months. She just needed 2 minutes. His eyes, his hand, 2 minutes to say the words that would change everything. She never got them. The gown was midnight blue, empire waisted, chosen 3 weeks ago when Vivian still believed she would wear it to a different kind of night. She had stood in the fitting room with her hands pressed flat against her stomach, not showing yet, barely anything there at all. She thought that this was the one she would be wearing when she told him. She had imagined his face, the way his expression would shift. That slow fracture she had seen exactly twice in 11 years. Once when his father died, and once when she said yes. She had built a whole version of the evening around that moment. She rehearsed it the way she used to rehearse client presentations back when she still worked. Back when she was still Vivian Arden, a licensed architect with a drafting table covered in her own handwriting, and not just Lorenzo Moretti's wife. That woman felt like a stranger now. She arrived at the gala in the third car of the motorcade, not the second. Lorenzo's head of security had quietly rearranged the seating assignments 2 hours before departure without explanation. She didn't argue. She had stopped arguing about things like motorcade positioning 8 months ago. That was around the same time she stopped mentioning that she had submitted a proposal to restore the Kellerman building downtown and never heard back. And around the same time, she stopped sleeping past 4 in the morning because the bed was cold and her mind wouldn't shut up. The Meridian Hotel Grand Ballroom had been rented exclusively for the Moretti Foundation annual charity gala. $2,200 a plate, 800 guests, and 4 string quartets rotating through the east and west wings. There was enough security personnel to staff a small airport. The foundation technically funded literacy programs in under-resourced school districts. In practice, it was the cleanest-looking surface on top of a very complicated machinery. Everyone in the room understood this without anyone saying so out loud. Vivian moved through the entry corridor with the practiced ease of a woman who had attended 14 of these events and knew exactly where the cameras were positioned. She smiled at the right moments. She accepted compliments on her gown from the wives of 2 state legislators. She shook hands with the CEO of a shipping company whose name she recognized from documents she had once accidentally seen on Lorenzo's desk and had been careful never to mention. And then she saw him. Lorenzo Moretti stood at the center of the main floor, the way a fixed point stands at the center of a storm. Completely still while everything moved around him. He was in a black suit with no tie. The collar of his shirt was open by exactly 1 button, which was the only visible concession to anything approaching ease. His jaw was set. His eyes were moving. Not quickly, not nervously, but with the slow, deliberate scan of a man cataloging every variable in a room without appearing to do so. He was talking to Senator Hale, and a man Vivian didn't recognize. He had a foreign accent, a thick watch, and the kind of posture that belonged to someone accustomed to having doors open ahead of him. He hadn't seen her come in. She waited. That was the terrible thing she had learned about loving this man. She had become someone who waited. She waited for him at dinner tables. She waited for him to finish calls. She waited for the right moment, the open window, the brief clearing in his schedule where she might be able to reach him. In the early years, waiting had felt like patience, which had felt like love. Now she understood that somewhere along the line the two things had quietly separated. What she had been practicing wasn't patience at all. It was disappearance. Small, incremental, almost polite. She crossed the room toward him. She wasn't rushing. She didn't have the energy to rush anymore. Besides, Urgency in a room like this registered as weakness, and Vivian had learned that lesson early. She walked the way she had been taught to walk in spaces like this. Heels on marble, shoulders level. Her expression was neutral with just enough warmth to be readable as poised rather than cold. She got within 12 feet of him before Serena Vale materialized from the left. Serena was Lorenzo's public liaison. That was her actual title. The one on her official documentation, the one she gave at press events and charity dinners. She was 34, Stanford educated, and fluent in 4 languages. She was extraordinarily good at her job, and she had been at Lorenzo's side at nearly every public appearance for the past 16 months. Vivian did not hate Serena. She had examined that possibility carefully, turned it over, and looked at it from every angle. She concluded that hatred would require a cleaner grievance than the one she actually had. There was no affair. She was almost certain there was no affair, and she had learned to live in the space that almost certain carved out. Because certainty was a luxury that didn't get delivered to the Meridian Hotel in a motorcade. What Serena represented was something harder to name and therefore harder to address. She represented the 11 hours Lorenzo gave to the organization each day. She represented the version of him that was switched on and present and engaged. The version Vivian used to be the recipient of. That was in apartments that smelled like fresh plaster, and evenings that ended with blueprints spread across the kitchen floor and Lorenzo's hand on the back of her neck. Serena touched his arm. Lorenzo turned to her immediately, naturally, the way you turn toward a sound you recognize. She leaned in, spoke close to his ear, and his expression shifted. Not dramatically. Just a small tightening around the jaw that meant something had come in from one of the northeastern families, or a shipment had been flagged, or one of the 14 ongoing negotiations that constituted the daily management of the Moretti Syndicate had hit a snag. Vivian stopped walking. She was 8 feet away now, close enough to be noticed if he looked up. He didn't look up. She stood there for a moment that felt much longer than it was. She was holding her untouched glass, wearing her midnight blue gown, and carrying a secret that was 8 weeks old and getting heavier every day. The chandeliers above her threw light down in warm, indiscriminate sheets. Someone laughed nearby. It was a big social laugh, the kind calibrated for rooms like this. A waiter moved past her left shoulder without making eye contact. She decided to try anyway. She stepped forward and got to within arm's reach. She said, "Lorenzo." He held up one finger without turning. The gesture was automatic, unconscious probably. It was the same gesture he used when he was on a call, and she appeared in the doorway of his study. It meant 1 minute. Except it was never 1 minute. It was never even close. Vivian looked at that raised finger for what felt like a very long time. Then she took a step back, then another. She found an empty stretch of wall near one of the service corridors and stood there with her back against the cool plaster. Her champagne glass was still full. Her whole chest was doing something that wasn't quite pain, but wasn't quite anything else either. It was more like the specific sensation of something you had been holding very carefully for a very long time, finally starting to slip. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth. It was the way the doctor had told her to, when her blood pressure had spiked at her last prenatal appointment. The appointment she had attended alone, taking a car service, because Lorenzo's driver had been reassigned that morning without notice. And she hadn't wanted to make anything of it. She breathed, and she looked at the room, and she tried to locate some version of herself that knew what to do next. Across the floor, Lorenzo was nodding at something Serena had said. His hand was on his jaw. That particular gesture meant he was calculating, weighing options, and running probabilities. Senator Hale had been joined by 2 other men. The foreign guest with the heavy watch was smiling now. The machinery was running. And Vivian was standing against a wall with a secret inside her, and nowhere to put it. She had not always been like this. That was the thing she needed herself to remember standing there, because it was easy to forget. Easy to start believing that she had always been this woman, this quiet and marginal presence in a marble room, when in fact she had been something else entirely. She had been someone who argued loudly about building codes at municipal hearings. She once drove 4 hours to a site inspection during a thunderstorm because she refused to let a contractor pour a foundation without her there. She had been someone who knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. She had looked at Lorenzo Moretti at a mutual friend's dinner party 11 years ago and decided with complete premeditation that she was going to make him fall in love with her, which she had done, and he had. In the years before he took over the syndicate, after his father's stroke, and after the brutal 8 months of internal restructuring that had cemented his control, Lorenzo had been a different kind of man, not softer exactly. He had never been soft, but there had been access to him, actual access. The kind where you could put your hand on his chest and feel his breathing change. He had driven 6 hours to her apartment once because she had mentioned offhandedly on a Tuesday phone call that she was craving the strawberry pie from the diner they had eaten at on their 3rd date. She just mentioned it. He had shown up at her door at 11 at night with the pie, and a look on his face like he didn't understand why this required explanation. That man was still in the building somewhere. She believed that. She had to believe that, because the alternative was that she had built the last 4 years of her life around a ghost. Victor Sorin appeared at her elbow at 9:20, which meant he had been watching her for at least 15 minutes before deciding to approach. He said she looked like a woman who was about to make a decision. Victor was 61, built like someone who had spent decades making himself difficult to move. He had gray at his temples and a stillness about him that most people misread as slowness. He was not slow. He was the sharpest man Vivian had ever met. He had been Lorenzo's consigliere for 12 years. And in all that time, he had been the one person in the organization who spoke to her like she was a participant rather than a prop. She replied that she looked like a woman who had been standing against a wall for 40 minutes. He said those aren't mutually exclusive. He accepted a glass from a passing tray and didn't drink from it. He told her that Lorenzo was going to be another hour with Senator Hale, maybe more. He said there was something moving with the Castillo people out of Miami, apparently. She said, there is always something moving. Victor simply said yes. No softening, no qualifier, just yes. She looked at him and said she needed to talk to him tonight. Something shifted in Victor's expression. Not surprise, exactly. Victor almost never looked surprised, but it was a recalibration. He asked what it was about. It wasn't a question, really. She wondered how much he already knew. Victor had an uncanny ability to identify what was true before anyone told him. She had always suspected he paid closer attention to the edges of a room than anyone gave him credit for. She told him it was something that couldn't wait much longer. He held her gaze for a moment. He said that after the senator clears, he would make sure Lorenzo had a window. She said thank you. He paused and said her name. She waited. He told her that whatever it is, tell him plainly, and don't let him defer it. He said it quietly. There was no judgment in it. Just the particular weight of a man who had watched things go wrong in this organization for a long time and had developed strong opinions about which warning signs to take seriously. She nodded. He moved away. She found a table near the eastern windows and sat down, looking at Manhattan, spread out below the Meridian's 14th floor. The lights of the bridges, the river dark between them. It was the geometry of a city that didn't stop for anything. She had loved this view once. She had stood at windows like this early in their marriage and felt like she was standing at the edge of something enormous and real, something she was genuinely part of. Now the view just made her tired. At 9:58, Lorenzo crossed the room toward her. She sat up. Her pulse did something involuntary. He was moving with purpose, as he always moved, cutting a line through the crowd that required no verbal navigation because people simply adjusted around him. He looked tired in the way he always looked tired. Not worn down, but compressed, like a man carrying too much weight too efficiently. He sat in the chair across from her. And for one moment, just one, the set of his jaw relaxed slightly, and he looked at her the way he used to look at her. And she felt the memory of the strawberry pie drive somewhere in her sternum. He said Victor told him she needed a word. She said yes and put both hands on the table. She said, Lorenzo, I need to tell you something important. I have been trying to find the right moment for it. His phone vibrated on the table between them. He glanced at it. She saw it happen, the small, involuntary movement, the split second of divided attention. He looked back at her and told her to go ahead. But the damage was already done somehow. The space had closed. She could feel it. She pushed through anyway and said, "I am pregnant." He stared at her. It was not the stare she had imagined. She had imagined the fracture, the shift, that specific look she had seen exactly twice. What she got instead was something that looked almost like incomprehension. A man being told something in a language he knew, but was currently having trouble parsing. Then his phone vibrated again, and then a third time. He picked it up. She said his name, and her voice came out smaller than she had intended. He said 1 second. He was already reading, his jaw set. He said there was a situation. He stood up. He told her he was sorry and that he would be right back. He looked at her, and she could see him trying to hold two things at once and failing. He told her later. Tonight. I promise later. He was gone before she finished breathing. She sat at the table for a long time after that. She didn't cry. She was past the point where crying was the natural response to things like this. That threshold had been crossed months ago, around the time she had started keeping the prenatal vitamins in her purse instead of in the medicine cabinet. She did that so she wouldn't have to look at them every morning and be reminded of all the conversations she hadn't had yet. She reached into her clutch and took out the ultrasound picture she had been carrying for 3 weeks. Black and white, grainy. The particular unremarkable blur that you had to be told was a human being before it resolved into one. She had carried it to 2 previous galas, 2 dinner parties, and 1 weekend in the Hamptons. She intended each time to show him. She looked at it for a long moment, then she put it back. She found her coat and left. The ride home in the car was 22 minutes through light traffic. She spent most of it with her forehead against the window, watching the city blur past. The driver didn't speak. The privacy screen was up. She was completely perfectly alone in the back of a car that cost more than she had made in her first 2 years out of graduate school. She was wearing a dress chosen for a moment that hadn't happened, carrying a baby her husband didn't know about yet. Later, she would mark this as the night the decision began forming. Not fully, not consciously. It was more like a hairline crack. The kind that runs through a wall long before anyone thinks to take it seriously. The penthouse was lit the way it was always lit when she came home without him. Automated system, warm tones, the illusion of inhabited warmth. She changed out of the gown and hung it with more care than it deserved. She went to the kitchen and stood over the sink, drinking a glass of water in the dark. She hadn't turned the lights on and didn't feel like it. She thought about what she had said to Victor. Something that cannot wait much longer. She thought about the way Lorenzo had said later, with such complete and unconsidered certainty. As though later was a place that always existed, as though she would always be there in it, waiting. She went to the second bedroom, the room she had quietly started calling the office, even though Lorenzo used it maybe once a month. She opened the flat files stacked along the east wall. She dug out the one she was looking for after a minute, unrolled it on the drafting table, and weighted the corners with the small brass spheres she used for exactly this purpose, the plans for the beach house. She had drawn these herself 3 years ago over the course of 4 months of evenings and weekends. That was when Lorenzo was still in the habit of sitting at the kitchen table with his own work while she worked at hers. It was a modest house by any objective standard. Nothing like the penthouse, nothing like the Hamptons property, or the villa outside Florence that the organization maintained. Single story, wide overhangs, designed to sit lightly in a coastal site facing the water. The kind of house that was primarily made of light and salt air, and the sound of something larger than yourself. Lorenzo had looked at the plans one night and said quietly that he wanted this. It was not a performative declaration. Just a man looking at a set of blueprints and meaning what he said. She traced the east elevation with one finger. She had been 17 weeks pregnant with these plans. Well, not yet. Not then. But now she stood over them at nearly midnight in a penthouse that felt less like home every day. Her stomach was slightly rounder than it had been 3 weeks ago, and the man who had said he wanted this had left a gala 30 seconds after hearing the most important thing she had ever said to him. And the word he had left her with was later. She stayed at the drafting table until 2 in the morning. She didn't draw anything. She just looked at what she had already made. At some point, her hand found her stomach. She wasn't conscious of moving it there. It just arrived the way hands do when they know something the rest of you is still figuring out. In the weeks that followed, she tried 3 more times. She tried a breakfast on a Thursday before his 7 o'clock call. She got through half a sentence before his phone lit up with an emergency from one of the Newark operations. She tried on a Sunday afternoon when he came home early, which was rare enough that she had marked it mentally as an opening. She got as far as sitting down across from him in the library before Victor called, and Lorenzo was on his feet again in 40 seconds. She left a note on his pillow once, just 4 words. "We need to talk," and it was still there, unread, moved to his nightstand when she came to bed 2 days later. He must have seen it. He hadn't asked. She told her doctor she was still planning to inform her husband. The doctor was a careful, neutral woman who did not ask follow-up questions. She bought a small pair of shoes, soft-soled, barely 3 inches long, yellow, and kept them in the bottom drawer of her closet behind a stack of scarves. She didn't have a reason for the yellow. She just liked it. Serena Vale came to the penthouse twice during these weeks, both times for legitimate operational reasons. Document signatures, and a preparation meeting for a Senate testimony Lorenzo was supporting on behalf of a lobbying interest. Both times Vivian was present in the apartment and was not consulted about the meetings, and both times she made herself coffee and went to the second bedroom and closed the door. She sat at the drafting table and reminded herself that she was not jealous of Serena. What she was erased. That was the word that kept arriving uninvited in the early hours when she couldn't sleep. Erased. Not dramatically, not all at once, just gradually. It was the way a pencil line fades when you keep going over it with an eraser, until eventually the paper is smooth where the line used to be, and there is no sign anything was ever drawn there. The loneliness was physical. She felt it as a specific pressure in her chest, a tightness in her throat, a strange weight in her hands that nothing she picked up quite resolved. She started going to bed earlier. Not because she was tired, but because unconsciousness felt like the only clean break she could access. She ate carefully. Not because she cared particularly, but because there was another person involved now, and that mattered even when everything else felt impossible to care about. She did not call her mother. Her mother had told her 3 years into the marriage that she was worried. Vivian had shut the conversation down because she was not ready to hear it, and the distance that created had never fully closed. She did not call her former colleague Maya, who had texted twice asking to catch up. Vivian had not responded to her because responding required explaining where she had been. And explaining where she had been required an honesty she didn't have the energy for. She did not call anyone. She existed inside the penthouse, inside the routine, inside the marriage, and felt herself getting smaller and more transparent by degrees. And she was not even sure anyone would notice when she was completely gone. 41 days after the gala, on a Friday evening in early December, Lorenzo came home at 6:30. This was unusual. She was in the kitchen when she heard the elevator, and her body tensed before her mind caught up. It was that particular autonomic response she had developed in the past year. The alertness that preceded either relief or disappointment, and increasingly preceded the latter. He looked tired, genuinely, deeply tired, but not compressed, not controlled. He was wrung out in a way she hadn't seen in a while. He sat down at the kitchen island without saying anything and put both hands flat on the stone. She asked if he was hungry. He said yes. She made pasta because it was fast, and she already had the water going. She set a bowl in front of him and sat on the other side of the island. For a few minutes they were quiet, and it was almost like the old quiet, the one that had been comfortable. Except it wasn't quite, because the shape of it was wrong. Then he said Castellano made a move on one of the Port of Newark terminals. He said they lost 3 people. She didn't know any of the 3 people. She never knew any of them. That was part of the construction of her life in this marriage. Proximity to consequences without access to the people who bore them. She told him she was sorry. He pushed the pasta around and said Victor had been managing the response. He said he needed to be in Baltimore tomorrow. She nodded. He looked up at her then. He actually looked at her, full eye contact, which was rarer than it should have been. He said she was quiet. She said she is usually quiet. He said, no, you are a different quiet. She looked at him. There it was. The smallest signal, the narrowest window. He had noticed something, some version of her absence. And for one moment, she had his actual attention and his actual eyes. She could feel the path forward clearly. She could say the words, the specific words, right now, and they would land, and something would shift. She opened her mouth. His phone rang. The ringtone was the one assigned to the senior captains. A specific tone she had heard so many times she could identify it at any hour. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. And she watched him make the calculation. She saw it move across his face, that brief and terrible arithmetic. He started to say he had to take it. She told him to take it. He took it. She picked up her own bowl and moved to the living room. She sat in the dark by the windows and ate her pasta alone while his voice carried from the kitchen. Measured, controlled, already operational. It was the voice of the Moretti Syndicate, not the voice of the man who had driven 6 hours for strawberry pie. After she finished eating, she washed her bowl and put it away. She walked past the kitchen. He was still on the phone, standing now, back to her. His hand was moving through his hair in the way it moved when he was building a plan. She went to the bedroom. She lay in the dark for a long time. At some point, she put her hand on her stomach again and stayed that way. She thought, very clearly and very quietly, that the person she was becoming was not who she wanted to be when her child was born. She did not want this child to have a mother who had folded herself small enough to disappear. She did not want this child to grow up watching her become less year by year, while the machinery around her kept running and nobody noticed the reduction. She did not want to tell her child someday that she had stayed because leaving felt too large, and she had made herself smaller instead. She thought about the beach house plans in the second bedroom. She thought about the yellow shoes at the bottom of her closet. She thought about a man standing at her apartment door at 11 at night with a pie, looking at her like the answer to everything was obvious. She thought about the word later, and all the space that word had been asked to hold, and how much longer it could hold it before it collapsed. Outside, Manhattan glittered the way it always glittered. Indifferent, inexhaustible, asking nothing from anyone. Vivian Arden Moretti stared at the ceiling and began in the quietest and most deliberate part of herself to figure out what she was going to do. She was gone from the bed before he came to it. He didn't notice until 2 in the morning, which told her everything she needed to know about the size of the gap between them. She heard him come in. The quiet of a man trained to move without announcement. She heard the bathroom, heard the mattress take his weight, and heard nothing after that. He was asleep in 4 minutes. She had timed it once early in their marriage, amazed by the ability. Now she lay on her side of the bed in the dark and listened to him breathe, and felt like a woman pressed against a wall in her own life. At 4:15 she got up. She went to the kitchen and stood at the window with a cup of hot water. Not tea, not coffee. Just water because the prenatal literature had made her paranoid about everything. She watched the city do its 4 in the morning thing, which was to carry on exactly as it had at midnight and would at noon. It was indifferent to the particular texture of anyone's insomnia. The bridges were lit. The river was dark. Someone's lights were on in the building across the way 40 floors up, and she wondered briefly what was keeping them awake and whether it was anything like this. She had made a decision. She understood that now, standing in the kitchen, in the cold blue pre-dawn. Not a final decision, not yet, but the shape of one, the outline. The way you can see the form of a building in a set of early sketches before any of the details are resolved. She didn't know where it led. She only knew that the alternative was to go back to bed and lie in the dark and wait for morning and repeat the previous day. And she was no longer capable of that. Some threshold had been crossed sometime in the night, and she hadn't felt it happen, only recognized it after. She went back to bed at 5 o'clock. She did not sleep. Lorenzo was up at 6:30. She heard the shower, heard him moving through the dressing room, With the quiet efficiency of a man who dressed in the dark so often he had stopped needing light for it. She lay still with her eyes open. He paused in the doorway. She could feel him looking at her. She said she didn't hear him come to bed. He said it was late and that he tried not to wake her. She told him he didn't. Another pause. She felt him deciding whether to come in, sit on the edge of the mattress, and do the thing a different version of their marriage would have called for. He didn't. She heard him put something on the dresser. It was his watch. She recognized the particular sound of it. And then he said he had to leave for Baltimore by 8 o'clock. She said okay. He told her Victor thought it would be one night, maybe two. She said okay again. She heard him pause again. He was standing in the doorway, and she was lying in the bed, and there were roughly 9 feet between them. And it might as well have been the Atlantic. He said her name. She told him to drive safe. He left at 7:50. She got up at 8 o'clock and showered and dressed. She ate half a piece of toast because her stomach had been doing things in the mornings that required careful management. And then she sat at the kitchen island with her coffee substitute and her phone. She did not call anyone and did not look at anything useful on the screen. She mostly stared at the middle distance while the apartment settled around her in its expensive, indifferent way. At 9:15, Victor called. She almost didn't pick up. Then she did. He said Lorenzo was on the road without preamble. She told him she knew. He asked if she was all right. She considered the question with more seriousness than it probably warranted. She said she didn't know, which was more honest than she had intended. A short silence. Victor's silences were always purposeful. He didn't leave empty air by accident. He said he was going to be at the Midtown office this afternoon if she wanted to talk. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. She asked him if he knew before the gala. She asked if he already knew something was off. He took a breath. He said he knew she had been trying to reach Lorenzo. The real Lorenzo, not the one that runs the meetings. He knew it hadn't been working. She asked for how long. He said a while, which meant longer than he was going to specify. She closed her eyes and said, okay. He told her to come to the office at 4 o'clock. He said he would have the building cleared. She went. The Moretti Group Midtown office occupied 2 floors of a building on 54th Street that looked from the outside exactly like any other financial services company. This was intentional. The lobby had marble floors and a receptionist who knew Vivian by sight and had probably been told to treat her accordingly. Victor met her at the elevator and walked her to a conference room with windows facing north. Pale winter light was coming through in long, thin bars. He poured her water without being asked. She sat across from him and put both hands on the table. She told him that Lorenzo didn't know about the baby. She said she had tried 5 times, and she couldn't get 2 consecutive minutes of his actual attention. Victor looked at her. He didn't perform surprise. He didn't perform sympathy. He just looked at her with those careful, still eyes and let her words exist in the room without rushing to cover them. He said she needed to tell him. She said she had been trying to tell him. He clarified that he meant she needed to make Lorenzo hear it. Not find a moment, but make one. He leaned forward slightly. He said, Vivian, if he doesn't know this and something happens, or if this gets further along and he finds out you carried it alone this long. She cut him off. She said that is his fault. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She told Victor that it was on Lorenzo, not on her, because she had tried. Victor said he wasn't assigning fault. He was telling her what he knew about Lorenzo. She said Lorenzo would turn it into guilt. Victor agreed, saying he would decide that the fact that she couldn't reach him proves he had already failed at this thing he didn't even know was happening yet, and that guilt would make him impossible to talk to. He paused. He said Lorenzo has a narrow window when he can actually hear something before it calcifies into something he can't process. She stared at him. She told him he was describing Lorenzo like a tactical problem. Victor said he was a person he had known for 30 years, not unkindly, but added that Lorenzo was also a tactical problem. Both things were true. She almost laughed. It came out as a short exhale. She asked when he got back from Baltimore. Victor said tomorrow night, late. She told Victor to arrange something the morning after. Not a meeting, not a dinner. Something where Lorenzo had no reason to have his phone out, and she was not in the building. Victor looked at her and said it was done. She nodded and picked up her water. She asked Victor about the thing with Serena. He asked what thing. She said she didn't mean anything by it, and wasn't accusing anyone of anything. She stopped and tried to locate the real shape of what she was asking. She said Serena was always there at everything, and Vivian was not. She made a gesture with her hand that was meant to indicate the inverse of everywhere, and mostly conveyed exhaustion. She said she wanted to understand how that happened. Victor was quiet for a moment that was slightly too long. She noticed. She asked what it was. He said carefully that Serena did her job, and she did it well. The decision about which events required her presence was made at the operational level. Vivian asked by who? Another beat. Victor said Edmund. She didn't recognize the name immediately. Then she placed it. Crow. Edmund Crow, senior advisor. It was the kind of position that existed at every level of the syndicate and was responsible for the management of appearances, public strategy, and the careful architecture of what was seen and what wasn't. She asked why Edmund would do that. Victor said he didn't want to speculate, which meant he had already speculated extensively and had arrived at conclusions he wasn't ready to share with her yet. He said what he would say was that some decisions about public positioning that he assumed Lorenzo had reviewed, he was not sure Lorenzo had actually reviewed them. She sat with that for a moment. It didn't make her feel better exactly. It made the shape of things slightly different. Not the wound, but the cause of it. She asked if Lorenzo was going to figure this out. Victor said he didn't know. He said Lorenzo had been managing a war on two fronts. He stopped, and for the first time in the conversation, she saw something move across his face that looked like guilt. He said he should have pushed harder on both of these things. She looked at him. 61 years old, she thought, and he was still capable of looking like a man who had made a mistake he couldn't take back. She told him he was not responsible for their marriage. He said no, but he was responsible for telling Lorenzo when something was wrong. And he had waited too long on this one. They sat in that for a while. The light through the windows was going gray at the edges. The afternoon starting its early winter retreat. She left at 5:30. She took a cab back instead of the car service because she wanted the noise and the friction and a driver who didn't know who she was and wouldn't open his mouth unless she asked him something. She had 2 days. The first day she spent mostly in the second bedroom, not drawing, just thinking in the proximity of the beach house plans. She ate what she could. She walked to the corner and back twice because the prenatal literature was insistent about movement. She did not call her mother. She bought a book at the pharmacy and read 40 pages of it without retaining any of them. She also found the prenatal vitamins in her purse, removed them, and put them in the medicine cabinet, a small act. She wasn't sure what it meant except that it felt like a kind of declaration. I am not hiding this anymore, even from myself. Lorenzo came home the second night at 11:40. She was awake in the living room, the lamp on, a book in her hands that she had given up, pretending to read around 10 o'clock. She heard the elevator and felt that autonomic tightening and told herself to breathe. He looked like Baltimore had taken something from him. His jacket was off before he cleared the entry hall. His collar was open, the controlled compression of his usual affect slightly loosened. He stopped when he saw her sitting there. He said she was up. She agreed. He came and sat in the chair across from her. Not the couch, the chair. The one with some distance to it. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment. She asked how bad it was. He said it was manageable. He said it the way men say manageable when something barely qualified. He said 3 families had been jockeying for the Newark terminals for 8 months. Castellano made a play, but they pushed back for now. She repeated the words, for now. He looked up at her and said her name. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard recently, a rawness close to the surface. He said he knew he had been absent and that this hadn't been easy. His phone lit up on the coffee table between them. Neither of them moved. The light pulsed once, twice, then stopped. A message, not a call. They both looked at it. She said, don't do it. She said it quietly, without heat, just directionally. He looked at her. Then he reached over and turned the phone face down. The gesture was small. In any other marriage, it would have been nothing. In this one, it was the closest thing to an olive branch she had received in 3 months. And the fact that she clocked it as significant made her chest do something complicated. She told him she needed to tell him something. He said he knew, which surprised her. He said he knew she had been trying to tell him something. He said he had seen it, but he kept thinking there would be a better time, something he could actually give proper attention to. She stared at him. She reminded him that the last time she tried to tell him, he left the table in 30 seconds. He said he knew. She reminded him that he said later. He said he knew. She said he had said later 5 times in 6 weeks. He didn't argue. He sat with it, the way he could sit with things when he chose to. That particular stillness that could look like either strength or deflection depending on the context. She put the book down on the cushion beside her. She looked at her husband across the narrow geography of the living room, and she said it plainly, the way Victor had told her to. She said she was pregnant, 12 weeks. She told him she had known since before the gala, and that she had been trying to tell him since before the gala. The silence that followed was absolute. Lorenzo didn't move. He didn't blink in any visible way. He just sat there with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and his eyes on her face. She watched the information travel through him the way a tremor travels through structure. Not visible on the surface, but detectable in the way everything very slightly shifts. Then he said, 12 weeks. She said yes. He processed that she had known for 8 weeks when he came to the gala. She confirmed she was going to tell him there, but he said later. She kept her voice level. She had practiced this in a sense. Not the words, but the steadiness. She was not going to perform this. She was going to say it like the truth it was. She told him she had tried 5 times since then, 5 specific attempts. She said she had this conversation in her head so many times that she knew exactly how many seconds each attempt lasted before something else took priority. He stood up, not away from her sight, just up. A man who couldn't stay seated inside what he was feeling. He turned toward the windows, and she watched his hands find his jaw, that calculating gesture. Except this time, it didn't look like calculation. It looked like a man trying to physically hold himself together. She told him she was not angry right now. She wanted to be clear about that. She stopped and checked herself. She admitted that was not true. She was angry. But she said she was telling him this because he needed to know it, not because she was trying to make him feel something specific. He turned back around. His face was doing things she hadn't seen in a long time. Not the fracture she had imagined at the gala, but something less composed than that. Something that looked like a man arriving somewhere he had been moving toward without knowing it. He asked if the baby was all right. She told him they were both fine and healthy. She said she had 3 appointments alone. She let that land. Everything was fine. He crossed the room and sat down on the coffee table directly in front of her. That was the closest he had been to her in months. Physically close enough that she could see the detail of him, the tiredness around his eyes, the tension still in his shoulders, the particular quality of his breathing, which was not steady. He said he didn't know what to say, which was actually the most honest thing he had said to her in recent memory. She said she knew. He told her he was sorry. She said she knew that too. He said no. He said it harder than she expected. He said he wasn't saying it as a reflex. He stopped and pressed his thumb and forefinger to his eyes for a moment. He said he had been so far inside running the organization, managing the Castellano situation, the Newark thing, and the political positioning. He said he had been so deep in it that he just couldn't see anything else. He didn't finish the sentence. She didn't fill the silence for him. After a moment, she told him that she walked into a room and had the most important thing she had ever needed to say to him. And he raised one finger and looked through her. And the word he left her with was later. She told him she went home and put the ultrasound picture back in her purse and did not tell him. And that night, she lay in this bed and thought that he didn't know she was disappearing. He didn't know because he stopped looking. Her voice did not break. She made certain of that. Lorenzo sat in front of her and said nothing. She could see that this was not because he was deflecting. It was because there was nothing defensible to say, and he knew it. She started again, telling him she hadn't decided anything about what she wanted to do next, or about what she needed. She was telling him this, so he knew the truth about what had been happening in this apartment while he had been running his war. He reached out and put his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. She also didn't respond to it. Her hand lay still under his, present but not reciprocating. He seemed to understand this because he didn't try to make it into more than it was. He asked her to tell him what she needed. She looked at his hand on hers. She thought about 12 weeks of silence, about 5 conversations that never happened, about the yellow shoes at the bottom of her closet, and the ultrasound picture, and the beach house plans. All of them were versions of a future she had been trying to get to through a door that kept closing. She told him she needed to think. She needed tonight. He nodded. He stood up. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked. The kind of looking that had been absent for months. The kind that cost something. Then he went to the bedroom. She sat in the living room alone, with the lamp on and the city outside, and the knowledge that she had finally said the words. Some part of her was waiting to feel relief, and the relief was not coming. The hairline crack she had noticed in herself 2 months ago was not hairline anymore. And outside, 40 stories below, the city kept going. She thought of something Victor had said. He will turn it into guilt, and the guilt will make him impossible to reach. She thought about Lorenzo's face when she said 12 weeks alone. She thought about whether guilt, if it was deep enough and real enough, could move a man. Or whether it would just calcify, the way Victor warned, into something neither of them could get through. She did not know the answer. She turned off the lamp at 1:30 and sat in the dark for a while, and then she heard it. A sound from the study, quiet and unmistakable. The drawer where he kept the old photographs opening. The specific soft resistance of wood that had warped slightly in the humidity of a New York winter. The sound she would have recognized in her sleep because she had heard it in enough of them. He was looking at something in the dark. She sat with that in the dark of the living room, and felt the hairline crack in herself spread another degree, thin and silent and absolutely load-bearing, and she did not yet know which direction it would go. She found out on a Wednesday, not from Lorenzo, not from Victor, not from anyone who owed her the truth as a matter of basic human decency. She found out the way people in her position always found out, sideways, accidentally, through the small structural failures that occur when a lie has been maintained long enough that the people keeping it stop being careful. It started with a folder. She had gone to the Midtown office to sign documents. Estate paperwork, something routine that required her signature as Lorenzo's legal spouse. It was the kind of administrative task that arrived in her life periodically to remind her that she existed in this organization as a legal category, if not always as a person. The building coordinator, a young woman named Priya, who was efficient and warm, gave Vivian the wrong folder. Priya probably didn't know enough about the interior architecture of the Moretti Syndicate to understand what she was handing over. It wasn't dramatically wrong, just adjacent wrong. The folder intended for her contained 2 signature pages and a cover letter. The folder she actually received contained those 2 pages plus a third document that had been misfiled. A communications log, internal, the kind that tracked external appearances and public event assignments. It detailed which principals were to be seen where, and with whom, and in what configuration. She would have missed it entirely, except that her own name appeared at the top of a column. And beside it, in the adjacent column, the word restrict appeared 14 times across 14 separate events spanning the past 18 months. She sat in the reception area chair with the folder open in her lap and read the column twice. Then she turned to the next page. The document was a strategy memo, unsigned, which meant it had been distributed internally without formal attribution. The language was operational, dry, the kind of prose that had been drained of any recognizable human intention so that the intention underneath it could move without being seen. But the intention was there. And once she understood what she was reading, it was not subtle. The memo outlined a public positioning strategy for Lorenzo Moretti in the context of ongoing negotiations with 3 external parties, 2 rival families and a federal liaison whose name had been redacted, but whose involvement implied the kind of political exposure the syndicate managed very carefully. The strategy identified Lorenzo's public image as a variable requiring active management. It recommended, in language that was almost clinical in its precision, that his appearances at public-facing events be configured to project singular authority and operational focus. The memo noted that the presence of a spouse at high-profile events introduced emotional variables inconsistent with the required image of command. Emotional variables. She read that phrase 3 times. The memo went on. It recommended the consistent positioning of a professional liaison at Lorenzo's side during all major appearances. It recommended the gradual reduction of spousal visibility at organizational events. It recommended that this transition be managed without direct notification to the principal's spouse in order to avoid internal conflict that could compromise operational stability. Without direct notification. She sat in that reception chair and felt the information move through her body the way cold moves through a building when the heat fails. Not all at once, but room by room the warmth retreating. They had done it deliberately. Someone had looked at her and decided she was an emotional variable, and built a strategy around making her invisible, and had done it without telling her, and had done it for long enough that she had started to believe that the invisibility was something she had done to herself. Priya reappeared from the back office and said there may have been a mix-up. Vivian asked who authored this. Priya looked at the folder. Her face did something that told Vivian everything about the degree to which this was a known quantity in the building. Priya stammered. Vivian asked again, "The memo in this folder, who authored it?" There was a pause that was slightly too long. Priya said she would need to speak to Mr. Crow about internal matters. Edmund Crow. Priya's expression answered before she did. Vivian closed the folder and stood up. She told Priya she would need a copy of this made. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform the anger that was moving through her in long, cold waves. She had learned, somewhere in 11 years of being married to a man whose world ran on the careful management of visible emotion, that the most dangerous thing in a room was a woman who was furious and quiet about it. She took the copy. She left the building. She stood on 54th Street in the December air with the folder under her arm, her breath making small clouds. Her whole body was absolutely still while the city moved around her. She called Victor. He picked up on the second ring. She said she needed to see him right now. Something in her voice communicated the exact nature of the situation, because he told her 15 minutes at the office on 46th Street, and hung up. She was there in 12. Victor was alone. His jacket was off, which was unusual for him. He took one look at her face, and didn't offer coffee or water, or any of the social lubricants he normally used to manage the beginning of a difficult conversation. He just pulled out a chair and sat down across from her and waited. She put the memo on the table between them. She watched him read it. She watched his jaw set, and then the particular stillness that came over him. The one that meant he was containing something rather than feeling nothing. She asked how long he had known. He looked up from the document. He said he knew Crow was managing the event logistics, but he didn't know the scope of this. She told him that was not an answer. He said it was the only answer he had. He held her gaze. He said he knew something was off about the positioning decisions. He raised it with Lorenzo twice, obliquely. He didn't have the specific documentation. He had an instinct, and Lorenzo was in the middle of the New York situation, and he let it go. He said he shouldn't have let it go. Her voice was very steady. She said her husband had been attending events for 18 months where someone deliberately arranged for her not to be present or visible, and that same someone created a paper record describing her as an emotional variable. And her husband apparently did not notice or ask questions about why his wife kept disappearing from his public life. Victor said nothing. She asked if Lorenzo knew. Victor said no. She asked if he was certain. Victor said he was certain. She believed him. Because Victor was not a man who committed to certainties carelessly. Crow operated below the level of direct authorization. He made decisions that he structured to look like operational logistics. Lorenzo signed off on event formats, guest lists, seating arrangements, and security configurations. He didn't sign off on this. Vivian said, but he didn't notice. That was the part she couldn't get past. He didn't notice that his wife wasn't there. Victor let that exist in the room without trying to navigate around it. She said Lorenzo needed to know today. Victor reached for his phone. She stopped him with one word. Don't. He paused. She said she would tell him, not Victor. She would tell him when he came home tonight, and she would show him this document. She told Victor to make sure Edmund Crowe was in the building tomorrow morning. Something moved in Victor's expression. He asked what she was planning to do. She said she was not planning anything. She was going to look at her husband's face when he read this, and then she was going to make a decision. She left Victor's office and walked, not toward home. She wasn't ready for the penthouse yet, wasn't ready for the particular quality of its silence. She just walked east and then south through the middle of a city that required nothing from her. The cold was useful. It gave her something physical to be inside. She had been trying to understand her own grief for months, and she had been doing it wrong. She had been treating it as a personal failure, something she had allowed to happen by being insufficiently present, insufficiently demanding, insufficiently whatever the inverse of invisible was. She had been folding herself around the edges of his life and calling it love, and wondering why it felt like suffocation. But the memo had clarified something. The invisibility had not been entirely organic. It had been, at least in part, constructed. Someone had decided she was inconvenient and had built scaffolding around that decision. And the scaffolding had been invisible to her because it was internal, because it moved through logistics and event management. It was the small administrative machinery of a criminal organization that she had never been permitted to fully understand. That knowledge did not dissolve the grief. It redistributed it. Lorenzo was home at 7 o'clock. He came in looking like a man who had spent the day managing something difficult, which described most of his days. And she was standing in the kitchen, and she said simply that she needed to show him something. He read the memo at the kitchen island. She stood on the opposite side and watched him. He read it the way he read everything, thoroughly, without visible reaction. His eyes moved down the page with the focused attention of a man trained to extract information from documents without telegraphing his response. But this was not a business document. Halfway down the first page, something changed in the quality of his stillness. It became not the stillness of control, but the stillness of a man whose control is the only thing standing between him and something he doesn't want to be seen doing. He finished. He put the document down. He did not speak for approximately 15 seconds. Then he asked where she got this. She told him. He picked up the document again and read the phrase. She saw his eyes stop on it, the same place hers had stopped, emotional variables. She saw his jaw tighten in a way that had nothing to do with calculation. He said Crowe's name. She said yes. He put the paper down with a deliberateness that was clearly effortful. He started to say he was going to take care of it. She kept her voice flat and direct. She told him she didn't care what he did to Edmund Crowe. That was not what this was about. He looked at her. She touched the document. She said this explains the logistics. It explains why Serena was always there and she wasn't. It explains the mechanics. But it doesn't explain why he didn't notice. It doesn't explain why for 18 months his wife was being written out of his public life and he never once asked where she was, or why she wasn't there, or when she stopped being in the room with him. His face was doing something she had no good word for. Not guilt, exactly. Something rawer than guilt. Something that preceded guilt. The specific expression of a person understanding for the first time the precise shape of what they had done. He started to speak, but she cut him off. She told him she knew what he was doing. He was running the organization. He was managing the families and the politicians and the federal exposure and the Newark terminals and every other thing that constituted his life. She knew. She had watched him do it for 4 years and she understood what it cost. She wasn't asking him to apologize for being who he was. She stopped and breathed. She told him she was asking him to understand that while he was doing all of that, she was being managed out of his life by a man whose job it was to make him look powerful, and he let it happen because he stopped looking. He said nothing. She told him she was pregnant with his child. 14 weeks. She had attended 4 prenatal appointments alone. She had carried a picture of their baby in her purse for 6 weeks, trying to find a moment to show him, and that moment never came. She had been standing inside this marriage, disappearing by degrees, and some of that was the organization, and some of that was him. Her voice did something small and involuntary. She controlled it. She said some of it was her, for not being louder, for not breaking down a door. Lorenzo was gripping the edge of the kitchen island with both hands. It was not threatening, the opposite of threatening. A man using the surface to stay upright. He said he didn't know how to fix this. The words came out stripped of every professional register. Just the words, just the man. She said she knew. He asked her to tell him what she needed. She said she needed him to notice 6 months ago, 3 months ago. She needed him to look up from the thing in his hands and see her standing there getting smaller. She needed him to ask. She picked up the document from the island and held to it for a moment, and then set it back down. She said she didn't know what she needed now. She needed tonight. He nodded. He was not going to argue. She could see that he understood at some fundamental level that he had arrived at a place where argument was not available to him. She went to the second bedroom. She sat at the drafting table. She did not turn on the overhead light, just the small lamp at the corner of the table. She pulled the beach house plans out and unrolled them and weighted the corners and sat in front of them for a long time. She heard him in the apartment moving to the study. She heard the quiet sound of his voice on the phone, low and controlled. She caught Crow's name once briefly, and then nothing. She thought about the memo language. Emotional variables inconsistent with the required image of command. She had spent her adult life being someone specific. Someone with opinions and skills, and a professional identity, and a history that predated this marriage by 30 years. And somewhere between the wedding and tonight, she had become a variable. A thing to be factored or excluded based on its effect on someone else's image. She thought about her child, about the particular responsibility of bringing a person into a world, and then modeling for that person daily what a life looked like, what love looked like, what a woman standing inside a marriage looked like. She did not want to model this. She looked at the east elevation of the beach house. Wide overhangs, deep porch, designed to sit close to the waterline. A house that was primarily made of light and space, and the kind of quiet that came from distance. She opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet beside the drafting table. She found her old professional portfolio, the leather one she had carried to client meetings before the marriage reorganized her priorities. Inside, behind the project sheets, she had kept certain personal documents. Her own accounts, her architectural license, still current because she had renewed it quietly last year without explaining why. Her original Social Security card, her passport. She put the portfolio on the surface of the drafting table beside the beach house plans and looked at both of them. Then she went to the closet and found the yellow shoes at the bottom and held them in her hands for a moment in the dim light. From the study, the apartment had gone quiet. Lorenzo was no longer on the phone. She could feel him on the other side of the wall. Not literally, but in the way you develop a sensitivity to a person's location in a shared space after 11 years. The particular quality of a room's silence that tells you which kind of absence you are in. She heard him move, heard the study door open, heard his footsteps stop just outside the second bedroom door. A pause. Then, very quietly, his voice through the door saying her name. She said nothing. He told her he was not going anywhere tonight. Just that. Not a declaration, not a promise, just information. The door didn't open. She sat at the drafting table with the yellow shoes in her hands and the beach house plans in front of her. She listened to him breathe on the other side of the door, and she understood with a clarity that felt like something breaking cleanly rather than shattering. That she had arrived at the specific moment she had been moving toward for months without knowing it. And the decision that had been forming in her since the night of the gala was no longer forming. It was formed. She did not make it that night. She sat with it in the small lamplight and let it exist. The way you let a thing exist before you act on it, because some decisions deserve the dignity of being fully known before they are executed. But it was there. Solid and quiet and entirely her own. The first thing in months that felt entirely her own. and she held the yellow shoes and looked at the blueprint of the house she had designed for a life she still wanted, but could not reach from here. And outside the window, Manhattan was endless. She was gone by Thursday morning, not dramatically. That was the thing nobody would understand later. The thing that made it harder to explain than a fight or a slammed door or any of the clean theatrical exits that people imagined when they thought about a woman leaving. There was no scene. There was no note composed in anger. There was just Vivian up at 5:15, moving through the penthouse in the gray pre-dawn with the deliberate quiet of someone who had made a decision and was no longer in the business of second-guessing it. She packed one bag, not a suitcase, a bag, the kind you carry on a shoulder, the kind that fit exactly what she needed and nothing more. She took her passport, her license, her own bank cards. She took the prenatal vitamins from the medicine cabinet. She took the yellow shoes. She took the portfolio with her documents. She did not take the jewelry. She did not take anything that had been given to her in the context of being Lorenzo Moretti's wife rather than Vivian Arden. And the distinction was clean in her mind, cleaner than anything had felt in years. She stood in the second bedroom for 2 minutes. She looked at the beach house plans on the drafting table, still unrolled, the brass weights at the corners exactly where she had placed them the night before. She did not take the plans. They were hers. She had drawn them. They lived in her hands and her head, and she did not need the paper to keep them. She wrote one sentence on a notepad she found in the drafting table drawer. "I don't want to disappear anymore." She left it on the kitchen counter beside the coffee maker. She removed her wedding ring and placed it on top of the note with a precision that was not cruelty. She was not trying to make a weapon of it. It was simply the most honest thing she could do with an object that had come, over time, to represent a contract whose terms had been quietly altered without her consent. She called a car service from her personal account, not the Moretti household account. She rode the elevator down alone. The lobby attendant wished her good morning, and she said good morning back. The car was waiting. She did not look up at the building as they pulled away. Lorenzo found the note at 6:43. She knew this because Victor called her at 6:51. She didn't answer. He called twice more in the next 20 minutes. She turned the phone over in her lap and watched the screen light up, and dark and light and dark, and did not answer because she was not ready to be reached. And the act of not answering felt like the first clean use of her own will in longer than she could precisely identify. She was on a train by 8 o'clock, not a plane. Planes required logistics, documentation that could be tracked through channels she understood Lorenzo had access to. She was not hiding in any desperate sense, but she needed to move at a pace that gave her time to breathe before anyone could arrive with a car full of men whose job it was to return things to where they belonged. She was not a thing. She needed distance in order to make that clear to herself as much as anyone. She got off at a coastal station 3 hours out, a town small enough that nobody looked up when a stranger walked through it. She found a diner that smelled like coffee and bacon grease and sat in a booth by the window. She ordered eggs she mostly didn't eat and a glass of water. She sat there for 40 minutes while the town moved around her at its own pace, indifferent and unhurried and nothing like Manhattan. A woman came to refill her water. Late 60s, gray hair pulled back. She had the particular no-nonsense warmth of someone who had spent a career reading people in booths. She looked at Vivian, at the bag on the seat, the lack of a coat for the weather, and the quality of her stillness. She said simply, "You need somewhere to land." Vivian looked up at her. The woman said her name was Eleanor, and she had a guest room. She wasn't asking questions. She set the water pitcher down and added that there was a good doctor in this town, if that mattered to her right now. Vivian sat with this for a moment, then said it mattered. Eleanor's house was a quarter-mile from the water, 2 stories, with a front porch that faced a stand of bare winter trees, and beyond them a gray Atlantic sky. It was warm inside. It smelled like wood smoke and old books. Eleanor gave her the room on the second floor with the east window and left clean towels on the bed. She said dinner was at 6 o'clock and left her alone. Vivian sat on the edge of the bed and put her hand on her stomach and breathed. She was here. She had done the thing. Whatever came next, and she understood clearly that what came next was a version of chaos she could not fully control. She was here and she had chosen it, and the choosing had cost her something, but it had also returned something. And the thing it had returned was her own name, her own breath, the specific and irreducible weight of being Vivian Arden in a room that nobody had arranged to manage her absence from. She had let herself cry for approximately 7 minutes. Then she washed her face and went downstairs and had dinner with Eleanor and didn't explain anything. And Eleanor didn't ask. In the penthouse, the morning after she left, Lorenzo stood in the kitchen holding the note and the wedding ring, and did not move for a very long time. Victor arrived at 8:15. He let himself in with the key Lorenzo had given him 20 years ago for emergencies. He found Lorenzo still in the kitchen, still in yesterday's shirt. The note was on the counter, the ring beside it. Victor looked at both items and then looked at Lorenzo and said nothing for a moment. He understood that there was a specific quality to what he was looking at, and that it required some seconds. Then he told Lorenzo that she was safe. Lorenzo's head came up. He asked if Victor knew where she was. Victor said no, but she left by her own choice, and she left quietly, and she was not in danger. She left because she needed to leave. Victor moved to the coffee maker and added that that was different from missing. Lorenzo said she was pregnant. The words came out stripped, just the fact. Victor said he knew. Lorenzo said she was 14 weeks pregnant and she was alone somewhere, and he didn't know where. Victor said she would contact them when she was ready. Lorenzo's control cracked briefly. The first time Victor had seen it crack in years. He said that was not good enough. Victor poured coffee and set a cup in front of him. He told Lorenzo that she had told him she was disappearing. She told him she had been disappearing for months. She left him a note that said she didn't want to disappear anymore. This was her telling him she was choosing herself. He told Lorenzo that he did not get to respond to that by making it about his urgency. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man being told something accurate that he doesn't want to accept. Lorenzo brought up Edmund Crowe. Victor asked, what about him? Lorenzo said he wanted him in the office this morning. Victor looked at him and said that was already arranged. Edmund Crowe arrived at 9:30. He was 53, trim, with the careful kind of handsome that came from decades of image consciousness. He had been with the organization for 11 years, had Lorenzo's complete professional trust, and walked into the conference room on the 41st floor, with the bearing of a man who considered his position secure. Lorenzo was sitting at the head of the table when Crowe came in. Victor stood near the windows. The document, Crowe's memo, Vivian's copy, was on the table between them. Crowe saw it. His stride didn't visibly break, but something in his face made a small involuntary adjustment. Lorenzo did not say anything for a long moment. He let the document and the silence do the work. Then he told him to sit down. Crowe sat. Lorenzo told him to tell him about the positioning strategy. Crowe looked at the document, looked at Lorenzo. He was calculating. She would have recognized it. The same arithmetic she had watched Lorenzo perform. The rapid assessment of what was known versus what could be managed. Crowe said the strategy was developed to support the public narrative during the federal exposure period. He said he made operational decisions consistent with the organizational goals that Lorenzo had outlined. Lorenzo cut him off. He said he had outlined no such goal. The goal of projecting singular command authority was never articulated to him as requiring the deliberate exclusion of his wife from public appearances. Lorenzo's voice was completely level, which was more frightening than raised. Lorenzo continued. He said he reviewed event formats. He approved guest configurations. He did not approve a strategy memo describing his wife as an emotional variable and authorizing her systematic removal from organizational events without her knowledge. Crowe said nothing. Lorenzo said Crowe built a paper trail that was designed to look like operational logistics and buried it below the level of his direct review. Crowe said he made judgment calls that were consistent with Lorenzo's needs. Lorenzo stopped him. The word was quiet and final. He said he was not going to debate Crowe's judgment. He wanted him to understand what those judgment calls cost. Lorenzo stood up. He moved to the window and stood with his back to the room for a moment, looking at the city. He said his wife spent 18 months being managed out of his life by a strategy he didn't know existed. She spent those months trying to reach him through a structure Crow had made deliberately difficult to move through. And she was now gone. He stopped. His hands were behind his back, completely still, which Victor recognized as the posture of a man exercising maximum restraint. He said, "She is gone, and she is carrying my child." The room was very quiet. Crow said carefully that the intention was never to cause harm to Mrs. Moretti. The intention was to protect the organization. Lorenzo turned around. The expression on his face ended the sentence. He told Crow he was removed. Effective this moment, his access to all organizational systems would be revoked within the hour. He would return all documentation in his possession. He would not contact any member of this organization or any of their associates. Victor would manage the transition of his responsibilities. He paused and added that if he found at any point that Crow's decisions during this period created exposure or liability beyond what he currently understood, the consequences would be proportionally more severe. He asked if Crow understood him. It was not a question. Crow stood. He was managing his expression with everything he had, and it was almost working. He said yes. Lorenzo told him to get out. Victor walked him to the elevator. Lorenzo sat back down in the chair at the head of the table and put both hands on the document and looked at it for a long time after they were gone. The act of removing Crow had taken 18 minutes and had been the easiest thing he had done all morning, and had changed nothing that actually mattered. He pulled out his phone and called Victor on his way back down the hall. Victor said she turned her phone off before Lorenzo could ask. Lorenzo said he knew. He stood up and went back to the window. Manhattan below him, the bridges, the water. Somewhere in that direction or north of it or south of it, on a train or in a car or in a room he couldn't locate. The mother of his child was making decisions he had given her no reason not to make. He told Victor to tell him what he was supposed to do. Victor came back into the room. He sat across from Lorenzo and was quiet for a moment. He said Lorenzo was asking the wrong question. Lorenzo asked what the right one was. Victor said the right question is what she needs, not what Lorenzo was supposed to do. Victor set his hands on the table. He said she spent months trying to get Lorenzo's attention and couldn't. She was not going to respond to him sending people after her. She was not going to respond to resources or assets or any of the things he had available to deploy. She didn't leave because he didn't have enough power. She left because she stopped believing the power was being used in her direction. Lorenzo looked at him and asked what he was saying. Victor said he was saying Lorenzo should find her if she lets herself be found. And when he does, he shouldn't go as the man who runs this organization. He should go as the man who drove 6 hours for a pie. Victor stood up and added that he must go alone. No car, no detail, no infrastructure. Just Lorenzo. Lorenzo was quiet. Victor said she drew those plans, the house. Lorenzo looked at them and said he wanted that. Victor asked if he meant it. Lorenzo said yes. Victor told him to start meaning it in a way that required something from him. Victor picked up his jacket. He said he would manage Baltimore and the Castellano response and anything else that came through the next few days. He told Lorenzo to handle his family. He left. Lorenzo sat in the conference room alone for 20 minutes. Outside, the city moved. 41 floors below, the building lobby received and discharged its daily population of people going about business that had nothing to do with any of this. Somewhere 3 hours away, or 4 or 6, he didn't know. Vivian was breathing and making choices and carrying 14 weeks of his child, and he had not been present for a single appointment, a single morning, a single moment of that particular kind of ordinary that turned out to be the kind you couldn't buy back. He made 2 calls. The first was to his most trusted captain, authorizing a full operational handover for a minimum of 2 weeks. The second was to his personal accountant, transferring funds to a secondary account he hadn't used since early in the marriage. Back when he still thought of money as something personal. He went back to the penthouse. He changed clothes. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the counter where the note had been. He had folded it and put it in his jacket pocket, and the ring, which was still there. He picked the ring up, held it for a long moment. He did not put it in his pocket. He closed his hand around it. He packed a bag much like the one she had packed. Single shoulder, light, nothing organizational about it. He found the car in the garage and got in and sat behind the wheel for a moment, which was unusual because he hadn't driven himself anywhere in 4 years. He put the address of the town into the GPS. He didn't know it was right. He was working on instinct and the one text that had come through from Vivian's phone before she turned it off. Not to him, but to Victor. 3 words. I am all right. The ping had been brief and imprecise, but it had pointed north and east and toward the coast. And Lorenzo Moretti had built an empire partly on the ability to move toward incomplete information, and he was going to use that ability now for the first time in years for something that was not the empire. He pulled out of the garage. He drove north. The city thinned around him as he moved through it, the density giving way to the particular openness of a highway in December, the sky gray and wide. The road ahead of him the most honest thing he had looked at in months. He drove for 2 hours before he let himself think about what he was going to say. And when he thought about it, really thought about it, without the organizational language and the management instincts and the automatic calculation, what he arrived at was not a strategy. It was a man who had gotten lost inside the thing he was trying to protect and had not noticed the cost until the cost walked out the door and left a wedding ring on the kitchen counter and a note that said she didn't want to disappear anymore. He gripped the wheel. He drove. He found the town at 11:30. Small harbor, one main street, a diner with fogged-up windows. The smell of salt coming off the water even in the cold. He didn't know where she was exactly. He drove the main street twice. He parked in front of the diner. He walked in. The woman behind the counter was in her late 60s with gray hair. She had the kind of eyes that had been measuring people for a long time. She looked at him the way Eleanor Brooks looked at everyone who walked through that door. As a thing that could be read, she told him he looked like a man looking for someone. He said he was. She studied him for a moment. She said Vivian told her nobody was going to come for her like she was something lost. Lorenzo said she was not lost. She left. Eleanor looked at him for another long moment, the kind of look that required something from the person being looked at. He said there was a difference. Eleanor said she understood the difference. Eleanor reached under the counter for her coat. He followed her out into the cold and down the main street and onto a side road that curved toward the water, and the Atlantic was visible now between the houses, gray and enormous, and the wind off it had teeth. Eleanor stopped in front of a white clapboard house with a porch facing east. She looked at him one more time. She said Vivian was in there, but what he did next was on him. She told him what she told the last man who stood where he was standing. She is not a problem to be solved. Lorenzo nodded. Eleanor went back the way she had come. He stood at the gate of the house and looked at the east window on the second floor. He saw, just briefly, the movement of a silhouette. Someone standing at the window looking at the water, or looking at the street, or some combination of both. And he did not know if she had seen him yet. And the not knowing was the most exposed he had felt in years. More exposed than any negotiation, more exposed than any threat. Because this was not a territory he could control, and she was not a variable he could manage. And the man who had built his life on the ability to hold the center of a room had arrived at a gate on a coastal road in December with a wedding ring in his hand and nothing else. She had seen him from the window. She had been standing at the east window, watching the Atlantic do what it always did, move without asking permission from anything. Then the motion at the gate registered in her peripheral vision, and she turned, and there he was. No car behind him, no men with him, just Lorenzo, standing at Eleanor's gate in a coat she recognized from 3 winters ago. He was holding something in his right hand, looking at the house with the particular stillness of a man who had used up all his momentum getting here and was now operating on something that wasn't momentum at all. She stood at the window for a long moment. Her hand was on the glass. The glass was cold. She did not move toward the door. She did not move away from the window. She stood in the specific suspension of a person who has made a decision and is now being asked by life to inhabit it in real time, which is always harder than making the decision was. She heard Eleanor come back alone, heard the front door. heard Eleanor's voice from downstairs, even in neutral, saying he was at the gate and asking what she wanted to do. Vivian looked at the water for another few seconds. At the gray of it, the scale of it, the way it moved without drama or hesitation. She told Eleanor to tell him to come in. She heard the front door open again. She stayed at the window. She heard his footsteps on the porch. She knew the specific weight of his step, the sound his shoes made on wood, and then the door and Eleanor saying something brief. And then the house receiving him the way houses receive people, with a change in the air that was almost perceptible. She listened to him come up the stairs. He stopped outside the door. She could hear him breathing on the other side of it. That told her something about the state he had arrived in, because Lorenzo Moretti's breathing was not normally audible. A pause. Then he said her name. She told him to come in. He opened the door. He looked like the drive had done something to him. Not the way fatigue does something to a person. He had operated on less sleep than this, without visible effect for years. But something more internal. A reduction of the usual controlled surface that left him looking closer to his actual age. Closer to the actual texture of what was happening inside him. He was holding his right hand, slightly closed at his side. He stood in the doorway of Eleanor's guest room and looked at her standing at the window. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The room between them was small. The east window behind her let in the gray coastal light. Outside, the Atlantic moved. She said he came alone. He said yes. She said no one knew he was here. He said Victor knew the general direction, and that was it. She looked at his face, the jaw she had memorized, the set of his eyes, the way a decade of tension had made certain lines permanent. He was 51 years old, and she had loved him for 11 years. And standing here in this small room in Eleanor's house, she felt both of those facts at their full weight, which was considerable. She told him she was not coming back because he came. She needed him to understand that first. He said he knew. He wasn't angry that she came. But she told him that him being here was not a problem he could close by showing up. He said he knew that too. She turned back to the window briefly, then turned around to face him. She asked him what he had come to do. He crossed the room, not quickly, not with the controlled directional force he used when he moved through rooms that belonged to the organization. He crossed this room the way a man crosses a room when he doesn't know if he is welcome in it, and is coming anyway. He stopped in front of her close enough that she could see the detail of his face, the tiredness around his eyes, the something else underneath the tiredness that she hadn't seen in years. He opened his right hand. Her wedding ring sat in his palm. She looked at it, then at him. He said he didn't bring it to give it back, not unless she wanted it. He brought it because it was hers, and he didn't want it sitting on a counter. She looked at the ring for a long time. She told him to sit down. There were 2 chairs in the room, a small table between them, the kind of setup that existed in spare rooms without particular intention. They sat across from each other the way they had sat across kitchen islands and conference tables and charity dinner tables, except that none of those rooms had smelled like salt and wood smoke, and none of them had been chosen by Vivian rather than arrived at by default. She told him to tell her what he understood. He looked at her, not past her, not at the middle distance, at her specifically. The eye contact that had been scarce for so long it registered as its own kind of information. He said he understood that she spent months trying to reach him, and he wasn't reachable. He said it without softening. He said he understood that he gave every functional hour to the organization and told himself it was protection, and it was also abandonment. And those 2 things weren't as far apart as he made them. He said he understood that she carried a pregnancy alone for 14 weeks and attended 4 medical appointments alone and bought shoes. He stopped. Something moved in his face. He told her he found the other pair, the yellow ones, in the closet. She had left them. Moccasins. She had left them. She hadn't fully understood why until this moment sitting here. She had left them because they belonged to a future she hadn't given up on yet. He continued, saying he understood that Crow built something inside the organization that worked against her, and that he didn't see it because he had stopped looking in her direction. And the reason he had stopped looking, that was not Crow. That was him. He said Crow found space that already existed because he had stopped occupying it. She said nothing. He said he understood that she wrote a note that said she didn't want to disappear anymore, and that the fact that she had to write that note, that she had been disappearing for long enough to know the word for it, is the thing he couldn't handle. He stopped again. His jaw was tight. He said he couldn't make that right. He couldn't go back and be present for those 4 appointments, or the night of the gala, or any of the 5 times she tried to tell him. He couldn't give her back the weeks she spent carrying this alone. The room was very quiet. The wind off the water moved against the window glass. She told him no, he couldn't. He said he knew. She looked at her hands in her lap. She asked him if he wanted to know what the worst part was. He said yes. She said the worst part wasn't the Crow memo. It wasn't even the gala, or the finger he raised, or the letter. She looked up at him. She said the worst part was that she started to believe it was her, that she had made herself small, that the invisibility was something she had done to herself because she wasn't trying hard enough, or being loud enough, or whatever the version is where it was her fault. She held his gaze. She said maybe some of it was. Maybe she should have broken down a door. Maybe she should have said the thing plainly in the middle of a meeting and not cared about the room. But she had also been trained by 11 years of living in the margins of his world to manage herself quietly so she didn't create problems for him. Lorenzo's hands on the table were very still. She told him that was what she couldn't give back to him either. The 4 years she spent shrinking. She could be angry at Crow for the mechanics of it. But the shrinking, that happened because the shape of their marriage left room for it, and they both let that shape happen. He said yes, and that he didn't want to do that again. She said she knew. But she needed him to understand what she meant when she said that. She didn't, and she needed promises. Promises in this marriage had been, and she made a small gesture that covered a large amount of territory. She meant she needed changes that were structural, real ones. Not him trying harder inside the same structure. The structure had to change. He leaned forward and asked her to tell him what that looked like. She had thought about this in the 3 days she had been here. She thought about it on the train, and in the diner, and at Eleanor's kitchen table, and at this window watching the water. She had not arrived at a list of demands. She was not interested in demands because demands required enforcement, and she was done spending her energy enforcing the terms of her own marriage. What she had arrived at was a small number of clear things that were not negotiable. She told him he delegates. Meaningfully, not operationally. He identifies 2 or 3 people who can hold authority, and he gives it to them. Real authority, not conditional authority. He steps back from the daily management in a way that creates actual hours in a day. He nodded. She told him he comes to the next appointment with her. Whatever the next one is, he is there. He had missed 4. He doesn't miss another one. He said yes, and they build the house. He looked at her. She said not as a symbol, not as a gesture. They actually build it. She has the plans. She knows the site she wants. They build it, and they spend time in it. And it's not a vacation property or a strategic retreat. It is where they live part of the time with their child, in a place that doesn't belong to the organization. Lorenzo looked at her for a long moment. His eyes had something in them she hadn't seen in years. Something that lived below the operational layer. Something that had been there when he drove 6 hours for a pie and hadn't been easily visible since. He said, okay. She told him that was not a yes to everything being fine. He said he knew. She said that was a yes to a starting point. He said he knew again, and this time the repetition was not deflection. It was a man accepting information at full value, not trying to negotiate the terms of it. She reached across the table and held her hand out, palm up. He put the ring in it. She held it between her fingers, looking at it. A plain band, white gold, chosen before the penthouse and the charity galas and the motorcades. Back when they had been 2 people in a city making promises they intended to keep. She set it on the table between them. Not on her hand yet, not given back. Just set down in the space they were both looking at. She told him she needed more time here. A week, maybe 2. She needed to be in a place that didn't remind her of who she had been becoming for a little while longer. He looked at the ring on the table and asked if he could stay. She considered this. It was not a small question. She told him not in this room. Eleanor had a second cottage down the road. Something in his face shifted. Not relief, not victory. Just the specific quality of a man who has been given a door that wasn't closed. Which was not the same as being welcomed through it, but was something. He said he wouldn't push. She said she knew. And she did. It was not naivety. She had been married to him long enough to know the register of his meaning. It was simply that she could read this version of him. This stripped down, unscheduled, car-driving alone version. And she believed him. He stood up. He looked at the ring on the table. He looked at her. He said he was going to go find Eleanor about the cottage. She said, okay. He moved to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, didn't turn around, just spoke to the room. He asked when the appointment was. She told him Thursday, next week. He said he would be there. He left. She heard him on the stairs, heard the front door, heard his voice briefly in the kitchen with Eleanor. And Eleanor's response contained a sound that was not quite laughter, but adjacent to it, which meant Eleanor had decided something about him that was not unfavorable. She heard the door, and then his footsteps on the porch, and then the path, and then the particular quality of the house that existed when he was 100 yards away in it, rather than 3 floors up or 3 hours down a highway. She looked at the ring on the table. She looked at the window, at the water. She picked up the ring. She held it. She did not put it back on her finger that day, or the next day, or the day after that. But she kept it with her in the pocket of her coat, where her hand found it at intervals she did not plan. On the porch, watching the morning come in, walking the road toward the water and back. Sitting across from Lorenzo at the diner, on the third day when Eleanor suggested, without particular subtlety, that the two of them might share a meal. The meal was difficult, not hostile, not even close to hostile, but weighted in the way that honest conversations between damaged people are weighted, because the weight is where the substance lives. He told her things about the past 4 years that she hadn't known, not justifications, but architecture. The specific way the Castellano pressure had consumed the bandwidth that should have gone elsewhere. The degree to which he had told himself that security and provision were the same as presence. The moment he had understood they weren't, and had kept going anyway, because stopping felt impossible. And now he understood that stopping for the wrong things was how you ended up stopping everything. She told him things too. About the appointments, the specific quality of sitting in a waiting room surrounded by couples when you were alone. About the ultrasound at 11 weeks, when the technician had asked if she wanted to hear the heartbeat, and she had said yes, and had heard it, and had cried in the car afterward, not from grief exactly, but from the specific ache of wanting to share something with someone who wasn't there. He listened without trying to fix it. She noticed this. It was not natural for him. She could see the effort of it. The small muscular discipline of keeping his hands still on the table instead of reaching for a solution. And the effort made it mean more than ease would have. They met at the diner for breakfast on the 4th day and the 5th. On the 6th day, he appeared at Eleanor's porch in the early morning with coffee in a thermos. They sat on the steps and drank it while the light came up over the water, not talking much, just occupying the same cold air. And it was the first time in longer than she could precisely identify that shared silence had felt like the right shape for a moment rather than a deficit. He came to the Thursday appointment. He sat beside her in the waiting room of the coastal clinic that Eleanor had recommended, in a plastic chair that was indifferent to who either of them were. And when the technician asked if they wanted to hear the heartbeat, he said yes before Vivian could answer. And then he heard it, that specific rapid flutter, the sound that was half technology and half something that technology was merely the instrument of. And she watched his face, and the fracture she had been imagining since the gala, the specific shift she had seen exactly twice in 11 years, happened. He pressed the heel of his hand to his eyes for a moment. She did not look away. He put his hand on her hand on the exam table, and she let it be there. And this time her hand was not still beneath his. They walked out of the clinic into the December air. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment breathing, and then he said he was going to call Victor. She said, okay. He stepped aside and called, and she heard him at some point in the conversation say, with complete plainness, as though it were a logistical fact, and also the most important thing he had said in years, that he needed the Baltimore situation handed off. He needed the full Castellano response delegated. He was going to be here for 2 more weeks, and then he was going to be available differently than he had been, and they were going to need to talk about the structural changes. A pause while Victor responded. Then Lorenzo said he knew it's not how it had been done. That was the point. He hung up. He looked at her. She looked back. They built the house the following spring on a coastal site 90 minutes from the city. Not Eleanor's town, but the same general logic of space and water and salt air, and a sky that went far enough to remind you of scale. Vivian designed it herself, modified slightly from the plans she had drawn 3 years before, with a wider east porch and a room on the 2nd floor that caught the morning light. She managed the build with a contractor named Ethan Mercer, who had been recommended by Eleanor. He turned out to be good at his work and entirely unconcerned with who Lorenzo Moretti was. Lorenzo spent 3 days a week there during the build. He learned to read her drawings, not perfectly, but enough to follow her reasoning, which was all she had ever wanted, someone paying attention to what she was making. He helped pour the concrete for the porch foundation one afternoon in April, which was completely unnecessary, and which he did anyway. And by the end of it, he was covered in concrete dust, and she was standing 20 feet away with her hand over her mouth, trying not to laugh. And the laughter came out anyway, and it was the first real laughter she had had in so long. It felt strange in her chest, like a key turning in a lock that had rusted. She put the ring back on in May in the kitchen of the finished house. Early morning. Just the 2 of them, no event built around it. She slid it onto her finger while she was standing at the counter and he was behind her. He saw it and said nothing, and put his coffee cup down and put his arms around her from behind, carefully, his hands on her stomach, where she was showing now, considerably showing. And they stood like that for a while in the kitchen of the house she had built with her own hands, in a town that didn't know them, with the water audible from the open window. She did not perform forgiveness. She did not have a moment of declaration or a speech about second chances. What she had was a morning in a kitchen, and then another one, and then another. The accumulation of ordinary mornings that were not ordinary at all, because she was present for them, and so was he. Their daughter was born in late August at the coastal hospital. A Tuesday afternoon, the light coming through the windows in long warm bars, Lorenzo was there. He had been there through the preceding 12 hours, and he was there at the end of it. And when the nurse placed the baby in his arms, he held her with a steadiness that surprised even him. Or maybe didn't surprise him. Maybe it was the specific kind of steadiness that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with the opposite. With a man finally putting down the things he had been holding too tightly. They named her after no one. She got a name that was simply hers. Vivian held her in the hours after, in the quiet of the room, and thought about the words she had used in the note she had left on the kitchen counter. Disappear. She had not disappeared. She had moved toward herself through the considerable difficulty of doing that inside a life that had been arranged around someone else. And the movement had cost things and changed things, and produced at the end of it a morning in a kitchen and a daughter with a name that was simply hers. The Moretti Syndicate continued to operate. Lorenzo had not walked away from it. She had not asked him to, and would not have believed it if he had. But it operated differently, with a structural delegation that was real rather than nominal, and with a man at its center who had learned at some cost the difference between running something and being consumed by it. He was not perfect at this. There were nights when the phone went too long, and mornings when the focus went elsewhere, and moments when she felt the old shape trying to reassert itself. When that happened, she said so, plainly, without managing it. And he heard her, not every time immediately, but consistently. The way a person hears something when they have trained themselves to listen, rather than simply wait for the noise to stop. Victor came to the house for dinner in October, on a Friday. He ate Eleanor's recipe that Vivian had made, and drank wine he claimed to only appreciate moderately. He held the baby with the careful awkwardness of a man unaccustomed to babies, and of considerable capability in most other areas. and he looked at Vivian across the table at some point in the evening with an expression she recognized. The recalibration, the private accounting. And she raised her glass slightly at him, and he raised his. And nothing was said because nothing needed to be. Edmund Crowe had been removed from the organization and had not been heard from. The three families continued their maneuvering. The Newark terminals remained contested. The world the syndicate operated in did not become simple because the people at its center had become more honest. But the house had a porch that faced east. And in the early mornings, when the baby slept past 5, which was not every morning, but enough of them, Vivian went out there and sat in the salt air with her coffee and the sound of the water. And sometimes Lorenzo came and sat beside her. And sometimes he didn't yet, and she was still there. And it was still enough. And the silence between the house and the water was the good kind. The kind that didn't require filling. The kind that two people make when they have said the true things to each other, and survived them, and chosen without sentimentality and without ease to stay. She had drawn this porch. She had drawn every board and overhang, and the angle of the roof, and the width of the steps. She had carried the plans in her head through the gala, and the empty penthouse, and the train, and Eleanor's guest room, and the exam table where she heard a heartbeat alone. And now she sat inside what she had made, and it was real. It was actual. It bore her weight without apology. And inside the house, her daughter slept in a room full of morning light. The water moved. It had been moving since before any of this, and would continue after. It required nothing and offered everything, and took exactly what the land gave it, and nothing more. Vivian sat in the salt air and drank her coffee, and she was, without performance or announcement, entirely present in her own life. That was all. That was everything. That was enough.